Will do. So welcome everyone. I'm glad to see some of you sort of repeat offenders who are back for more. It always makes my heart feel good. If you were in my last webinar, hang on one second. My dog is about to start barking. So welcome to the new world. I will be right back. So Audrey, sorry, give me 1 second.
She's welcome anytime. Now, if you're looking at the chat, take a guess as to Lisa's dog's name. And Lisa, what size is your dog? That might give a hint to the name. Smaller dog, smaller and cute.
Yes,
okay.
She's very feisty. Sorry, she's like 10 pounds.
We had one guess, 2 guesses to the name. Scrum is one, Ralph is one. Thanks, Art and Stephanie. That's awesome. What's your dog's name, Lisa?
Her name is Binky. Come here.
Hey, Binky.
And if you know me, you know Binky. This is Binky. She's ferocious. Okay, so we're gonna get started. So back to business. Apologize for that. If you were in my last webinar, we talked about how to do sprint planning in 30 minutes or less. And if you haven't seen that webinar, you can actually go to the livespeed.com website and you can watch that when you're struggling with what to binge watch on Netflix this weekend. You're welcome to watch that webinar instead. One of the key components of being able to do sprint planning in 30 minutes or less is having a really nicely defined, refined, estimated, prioritized backlog full of really small stories when you start sprint planning, which means it's very easy to just adjust what the sprint contents is for the velocity of the team. Now, obviously, it's hard to get to having that many about 2 sprints worth of stories in your backlog that are nice and small and estimated if you're struggling with getting through a grooming session. I was just talking to a team yesterday that spent literally 2 days together and got 2 stories groomed. This is not helping your team at all, and it's definitely not going to help you get your backlog in order or get your sprint planning done in a reasonable amount of time. I'm sure we've all been in those uncomfortable sprint planning situations and in our uncomfortable backlog refinement sessions. So this webinar is about how to get to the point where your team can groom 12 stories an hour, which for many of you probably sounds impossible, but I'm going to show you how it's done. And it does take a little bit of work for you and your team to get there, but it is entirely possible. And when you can do this, you can get a couple of sprints ahead. And when you can get a couple of sprints ahead, your sprint planning becomes easy peasy lemon squeezy. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Here's a little background about me. I am actually from Texas, and I do love to travel. In fact, I'm usually traveling. I'm currently in a hotel room waiting to close on a house. So I apologize for the background. We have a couple of guiding principles to these refinement sessions. And the first one is, above all, it should not be painful. So if you have been in a painful refinement session, this webinar is for you. It should also not be a substitute for asking and answering architectural questions or design questions. This should not be the time where the Scrum team is getting bogged down trying to figure out whether their architecture even supports a story that they're trying to estimate. It should be a very crisp and efficient ceremony. Once your team gets to having about 2 sprints ahead in the backlog, you're probably only going to need to do a half hour of refinement in each week, so maybe an hour a sprint. It takes a little work to get to that point, but once you sort of learn the tactics and the agenda and how to do this quickly and efficiently, this grooming session or this refinement session, depending on where you are in the world, should take maybe a half hour total a week. And we can talk later if you'd like about different ways to how to schedule that and how to kind of chunk it up so that it's easier on the Scrum team. The 4th principle is that it should be based on realistic expectations. And in other words, what do we actually expect to achieve during this grooming session? In other words, if I'm a PO and I come to a grooming session and I don't even know what I'm asking for in this story, you cannot expect to get an estimate on that story. And then finally coming in there with a very clear definition of ready. If you're familiar with your definition of done, having a definition of ready is very helpful to the Scrum team, but it's also a key to making sure that your grooming sessions are crisp and efficient and a good use of people's time. Finally, the last thing, as always, you should always discuss how your sprint ceremonies are going in your retrospective. It's always a great thing to talk about. Hey, did we do okay with that estimate? How was our agenda in our grooming session? How did we do in sprint planning? And just think about, well, if that didn't quite go the way we wanted, or we felt like maybe we were wasting time or swirling a little bit too much or over-engineering things, talk about that stuff as a team and figure out what you can change in your ceremony in order to make that better. And at the end of this, I'll actually give you some nice tactical first steps that you can take, some baby steps if you need to, or some other things to look out for, things that you might not be noticing that might be impacting how these ceremonies are going. Finally, it should be extremely disciplined and extremely outcome oriented. I'm sure this has not happened to any of you that you just sat in a grooming session and people just swirled and talked about all kinds of things and tried to solution too much, and it just took hours and hours, and ultimately at the end of it you still don't have an estimate on your little story. So if that is happening to you, the whole motivation behind this entire webinar is to show you guys how to make that a very disciplined, outcome-oriented ceremony in order to make sure that you have a backlog of stories that the Scrum team can work on, because there's nothing worse than having a dry pipeline for a Scrum team and then possibly even interjecting stuff in the middle of the sprint, which is going to slow your Scrum team down. So we're just going to go back to basics here. This is straight out of the Scrum, I love to always ground myself in the Scrum Guide. I work with a lot of teams who have moved pretty far from the Scrum Guide and have kind of forgotten what the fundamentals are. So we're going to talk about backlog refinement as it's referred to in the Scrum Guide. And now, trivia, backlog refinement is actually not a Scrum ceremony. It's not an official one, but it is kind of hard to do Scrum if you're not doing it. So even though it's not an official ceremony, teams wind up doing it. So there are a couple of things that Scrum, what this backlog refinement is not. One of them is the first time that a PO has actually thought through the requirements or the priority of the thing you're looking at. So this should not be, well, I'm not exactly sure how I want this to work kind of a conversation. If that's happening, you just need to stop it right there, send it back to the drawing board and wait until there's some clarity on the outcome from your PO. It should also not be the first time that architectural questions are addressed. What we don't want to see is something coming into a grooming session and the devs are like, that's a fantastic idea, but we're going to have to completely replatform, and that's going to take us a year if we want to implement anything like this. So those questions should be answered up front. Dev team, it's also your responsibility to make sure you reviewed these stories before you get in there. So this should not be the first time that you've seen a story or heard about its parent feature. That means the POs, as you start developing features, you need to have like a mini kickoff with the dev team, describe what the feature is, why you're doing it, kinds of things that you anticipate to happen, have those architectural and design questions already answered. And then when you start presenting the stories, there will be some familiar context for people to latch onto in order to have a good understanding of what the bigger picture is and help guide them in terms of giving their estimates. Also, absolutely do not spend your time, number one, over solutioning, or that's the last bullet, an opportunity for solutioning at all, and definitely not over solutioning. You do not have to figure everything out in a grooming session. But you also don't want to spend an endless amount of time just swirling about, well, maybe it could be this, maybe it could be that, what if that, what if that. Have all of that stuff already figured out before you get in there. And that's a huge burden on the shoulders of your PO or just your product management team in general, whatever their title is to make sure that that stuff is thought through. And I'm going to show you in a minute some of the ways in which you can sort of force those synapses to work in a way that ensures that the stories you come to grooming with actually are small and well thought out and have clear requirements on them. What the backlog refinement or grooming, and now I flip back and forth between those things, what it's meant to be is an opportunity to get good enough clarity on what the intended outcome is in order to give a good enough story point or relative estimate for the sprint after next. I'm a big fan of the N+2 thing, which basically is you should have your features figured out, a couple of features ahead, and you should have a backlog of stories that are about 2 sprints ahead, given whatever the team's velocity tends to be. So you want to be grooming stories, not for the sprint you're about to start, like in an hour, and not for the sprint that you're currently in. Definitely not. We all know that's not that's a no-go. But for the sprint after at least after the one that you're currently in. It's also an opportunity for a PO and the development team to knowledge share about what makes a good story. What kind of information do I need? What is too much in the weeds? What's not enough information? And it also allows the development team and the PO to work together to figure out, okay, if this is a good story, how do we get better at estimating these stories? Now, granted, POs don't estimate stories, but they can help when you find that your teams are constantly have half the team is estimating at a 1, half the team is estimating at an 8. That means there's something unclear about what the intended outcome is because people have different ideas about how this thing is going to be implemented. So that will help the PO then learn how to write stories with the proper kinds of information. That will allow the development team to give an estimate that they feel pretty good about. You do have responsibilities as a Scrum team, and again, Scrum team includes the PO and the Scrum Master. Development team is the devs and the QA. So as a Scrum team, you all have individual responsibilities coming into this, and some of them are role-based and some of them are just as a healthy team, these are things that you would do. So what the PO, and POs, sorry, it's a lot of responsibility for you, but this is kind of the job of the PO on the Scrum team, is to have good consumable work queued up for the Scrum team. That is the primary focus. That's the main reason for this role. You want to come to grooming with a backlog full of really good, small, ready stories. And if you're in whatever tool you have, they should be listed in priority order. You should have a good sense of what small means for your team. For me, that means smaller than 3 story points. They should be independent and they should be crystal clear. And this is a lot of work, and it may take you a lot of time to get caught up and make sure that you're feeding these things to the Scrum team. But once you do, it'll be super easy to maintain. And bonus, you'll actually get what you're asking for in a sprint because the Scrum team's not going to be confused about what you want. And so there's not a lot of back and forth about what did you mean here? Do you mean this? Should I test that? That will all be answered ahead of time. So minimal context switching, minimal swirl around questions, and your Scrum teams will actually be way more productive. And you get to give your business owners or your customers what they're asking for a lot more quickly. So this is key to delivering value really, really, really rapidly. The other thing is that as a PO, you have to come to this meeting with decision-making authority. If you have to come in and somebody asks questions like, oh, does this go on the left or the right? And you're like, well, I have to go escalate that and ask, my boss whether that should be this, and then they have to go ask the business, and then they have to go ask compliance. If all of that is happening, then you need to fix that, because whoever is standing in there providing these requirements to the Scrum team has to have decision-making authority about how these things look and function and behave and what the intended outcome is. If that's not happening, you're just going to wind up in a bunch of swirl and you're going to slog the team down. And then finally, a really, really, really clear vision of what you want. If you can't express clearly what you want, the Scrum team is going to have no idea what you want. They're not psychic, or maybe they are, maybe their license expired, I don't know, but they're not going to be able to code what you're asking for. And then at the end, you're just going to see this thing and it's not going to look like anything you had imagined, and then you have a whole bunch of rework. So as a PO, come in with a crystal clear idea of what you're anticipating, and then that will help the Scrum team actually implement what you want. That means that the Scrum team can also give you, or the development team can give you feedback on, hey, I know that this is sort of spec'd out to look like this and to function this way, but if we use a tool that we currently have, it might operate slightly differently, but you'll achieve the same outcome. What do you say we do that? Because it'll take a lot less time. Those are great conversations to have in here. So you want to know exactly what you want, but you also have to be flexible enough to get input from the dev team when they tell you, hey, if we do it slightly differently in this tool, then this will still achieve the same outcome, we think. What do you think of that? You've got to have a mindset where you're willing to let that happen so that you can get stuff out the door more quickly. Other contributions from the team: Scrum Master. It's your job to enforce the definition of ready. And by ready, I mean these things. It's in priority order. It's a small story. It's independent. It's crystal clear. I'm going to show you how to use gherkins here in a minute to make sure that your requirements are crystal clear. It is your job to make sure that that definition of ready is met before you bombard the development team with a bunch of noise and sloppy stories. I recommend putting a 5-minute time limit on stuff. Any story that is ready, you can estimate in 5 minutes. If you can't get an estimate on it in 5 minutes, it's not ready. It's sort of a two-way street there. You can put the 5-minute limit on it And you can just use that as your definition of ready. Like, we can get a good enough estimate in 5 minutes. If we have to ask so many more questions that it's going way past 5 minutes, it's not ready. So that's a great benchmark for your team. And that's how you get to 12 stories an hour. You come in 5 minutes, we don't have enough info, great, back to the PO, next story. And you just keep cycling through that. Use a timer. It's awesome. Use one with a loud and obnoxious buzzer in the beginning if you need to drive the point home that if we can't figure it out in 5 minutes, it's not ready, it's just noise. Go back to the drawing board and come back to us when you have something that we can estimate quickly. The entire development team, hopefully, once you start implementing these things, you'll start seeing a backlog starting to fill out where your product owner is working ahead of you and has started lining things up in your backlog. Review them in those moments that you're waiting for something to build or you're waiting for a script to run. Just glance over them and get a sense of what's coming up. Read through the stories, understand the requirements. And that way, when you go to grooming, you can ask questions that you've already thought about. Or you can tell a product owner, hey, I was reading the story and I think if we split this up, it'll be a little easier for us to do. Those kinds of things can all happen, and you should be taking the time. You should own that backlog as well, just to review it so that it's not the first time you see stuff when you come into grooming. And then finally, it's everybody's job to understand what the risks are for anything that's coming up in the backlog. Understand, is this a wonky area of the code? Is that really brittle? Is this in our legacy, stack that is always breaking? And there's all these things that we have to watch out for. Do we have the ability to test these things? These are all questions that you guys should have a good understanding of before you come into grooming, so you can figure out how you're going to deal with them. Any dependencies that they may have. It's really helpful for a PO when they've got everything in priority order. If they hear from a dev, hey, we have to do this story before we do that story because there's something, whatever the dependency might be, it's super helpful for a PO to hear that ahead of time, so you're not having that conversation in the middle of grooming. So if you can just take a second to glance over the backlog at some point during your day, during the sprint, you can avoid spending all kinds of time talking through those things in the grooming session. So I've emphasized a lot that we need good small stories, and my favorite way to do this is gherkins. I love a good gherkin because this makes it so completely clear for a Scrum team or for a development team what they need to code, what they need to test, and what the anticipated outcome is. If you think of how easy it is if you have folks who are logging bugs and they are really clear about steps to reproduce, like do this, do this, do this, do this, I'd expect to see this, but instead I saw that. This is that is crystal clear. You know exactly where you are in the code, you know exactly what's going on, and you know exactly what the intended outcome is, and also what inadvertently happened instead of that intended outcome. So it gives you lots of information to go in there and start to try to fix it. The same thing is true for gherkins. And gherkins, I'm not going to go into BDD and automated testing. What we're going to do is we're going to appropriate gherkins from the BDD automated testing world, and we're going to use them to help you create these nice, tiny, little crystal clear stories. And this is how they work. So you have your usual user story as a blank, whoever I am, whoever your persona is. I need to XYZ, so that, blah, 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 blah. Don't forget the so that, by the way. This is not a webinar on writing these kinds of stories, but please don't forget the so that. Super important, so you know why you're actually doing the work. All of the stuff needs to be written in plain English. If I see the name of a method in here or a database, I'm going to freak out. So do not use technical jargon or technical anything in there. What we want is for you to be able to show your grandmother or your CEO, they probably both have equal understanding of your technology, show either one of them this gherkin, these acceptance criteria, and they will know exactly what you're after. So this is how a gherkin works. It's over here on the right under acceptance criteria. You have the given, it's the context, it's when I'm on this page. That's it. That's all you need to know. That's an immediate clue to devs and QA. This is where I need to be. You might have additional things like I'm on this page and I've logged in successfully and I have, XYZ, something else. So you can kind of list those things. Don't get crazy because you don't have to list every precondition, because then you'll basically be writing like an entire workflow just in the context. There's a point at which that becomes overkill. You should be able to assume some things about, like, if I'm on that page and only people with certain permissions can be on that page, I don't have to list that I need permissions, right? Because clearly that doesn't matter, right? You don't have to list that out. I mean, it's that kind of thinking. It's a little bit of an art. So you've got your given, here I am, and all of these things are also kind of feeding into my context. When is super important. It's a single call to action. Notice there are no ands or ors on this. It is a one action that the user is completing. It's a click, it's a scroll down, it's a drop down, the page appears, whatever it is. It is a call to action. So if you think of it as something like a button, that would be a when. When I click the button, that's it. There's no and, there's no or, it's a single action. And then you've got the intended outcome. Then, okay, what's happening? Okay, so I'm here, I'm this person, this is why we're doing this work. I've clicked on this button. What do I expect? What do I, as a PO, want to see happen when this thing is done? So that's where you can add additional ands. Then this page opens up and I see whatever, the last thing I filled out, and I, can whatever. So these are all the additional things that you would anticipate seeing. You do not want to have too many ands in a story, because oftentimes those ands actually wind up representing different stories. So for example, if you're building a new page, and ultimately what you want is that when you open that page, there's something there, and then there's the ability to click here, and then there's a badge that appears there. Those, if you wind up putting lots of ands in the thens, that's a great red flag that probably these are all new functionality and can all be new features. So let me show you how this works. I just stole this from one of the groups that I'm working with, one of our clients. And this is an actual gherkin, and this is kind of how they wound up writing this. So she initially started with a single story that was basically, okay, they have two different systems, and it's just a whatever. We won't go into, past poor life choices about why these things are in two different systems, but they are in two different systems, and each system has a screen where the same information needs to be displayed. So it needs to appear on these two screens. And you get a checkbox, you get a box checked basically on this thing, on both screens. The logic works the same way, it's just in two different places. You get this checkbox if you have done like three things, if there's three pieces of logic that are true. You can also get that checkbox, if those three pieces of logic aren't true. You can also get this checkbox if on a different thing, those three pieces of logic are true. I know that sounds very convoluted, but this is one story for them. They had no idea how to estimate. It's the other great thing about small stories. The smaller they are, the easier they are to estimate. We are terrible at putting estimates on big things. When you get it down really, really, really tiny, it's so much easier to put an estimate. It's so much more as accurate as an estimate can be. I mean, they're not accurate, but you can have a lot higher confidence estimating 2-point stories than you can 8-point stories in terms of, how likely those are to derail your sprint. So go for the small stories. They're super clear, super easy to estimate. And this was an enormous story. Don't even get me started on batches, right? Because we all know how I feel about batches and enormous lists of requirements in one story. That's one big batch you're throwing at your dev and your QA. And if you know anything about lean, you know that drives me crazy. So we don't want batches. What we want is small individual things going through. But this was all one giant story. And this is what she did. And the assumption there on the dev team was, well, I'm already in there working. I might as well do all of that anyway. So it's this false assumption that having a large batch actually makes you more efficient, and all of the science, all of the data, all of the math is there that proves that this is not true. Batches are bad. You want to have small chunks of work going through your system. And then the other argument for having it all in one thing, and this part's actually true, is that unless it's all out there, there's no value to the customer. So I need to know, this is very critical, that I know that this thing has happened and that this person qualifies, because if they don't, all kinds of crazy things are going to happen. If they don't qualify and I start going through this workflow, all kinds of weird things are going to happen. And so, yeah, it's absolutely true that without this whole thing put together, it's not going to have any value to the customer. The difference here is between how we're going to chunk up the work to flow through the system, how we're basically going to craft our to-do list with different layers of value and getting to that final point, and then actually putting it in the customer's hands. You can flow this work through the system in tiny pieces. It does not mean that you have to go live with it that way. When you have the group and they're all done and they're all tested and everybody's happy, then you can expose that to the customer, and then the customer gets all the value. But you've allowed lean to work by having small chunks flowing through the system. It's basically, how are we doing the work versus the value that we're delivering to the customer. So it is true, that whole story has no value to the customer unless it's all deployed, and nobody's arguing that. The key is release it when it's all done, but work on it in small pieces. So there's always a good question here about how many stories you think this is going to turn into. And once we started diving deep and then starting to write additional stories for maybe error messages and pop-ups and things like that, it turned into a couple of dozen stories, believe it or not. And this is what the stories tended to look like. And this is how gherkins work. This is how you have small stories. This is how you groom 12 stories an hour. You have in this first case, it's one screen, and we're working towards this idea that there's this one set of requirements, and if you hit all three, then you get this badge. So given that I'm on the badges screen and my score on this one thing was greater than 50, when this list is displayed, then the box is checked, and then the contrary scenario is when that's not true. Well, that's just one tiny piece. The very next story, and okay, granted, that doesn't actually mean that the badge is checked, but this is a great test that the system is working and communicating with one another. The next story, you layer on a little bit extra logic. We know that first story is already completed and done and works. And so now it's, okay, not only do I have to get that first score greater than 50, I have to get the second thing score greater than 25. And then we can go in and work on that and code that and test that. Believe me, your QA is probably jumping up and down right now, because if they have to QA that as one story, there are so many logical paths that could go wrong that they are going to jump with glee that they can go in here and identify exactly where something broke. If they test this first story and it's broken, they know that's where the problem is, and they can send it back to dev to fix. If they test the second story and it's broken and the first one passed, they know, okay, well, it must be when you did the beginner level part 2, because the beginner level part 1 was already tested and it works. And that saves everybody time trying to figure out why a thing is broken. And this just goes on so on and so on and so on. So you would have to add the third criterion, and then you would know, okay, great, we've met this first thing, so we get our badge. Then you have to do this for the second case where, okay, I didn't meet any of those, but in a different universe, I meet these, and then you have to do all of those, and then you have to duplicate that for the other screen. So this did wind up being several dozen stories, and they all wound up being small, and they all wound up being 2 or 3 story points. And the interesting thing, this always happens, the original story was estimated at an 8, and they got several dozen stories that were all in that 2 to 3 range. And so you do the math, right? Which one of those do you think is a better representation of the work that it's going to take? So there are a couple of really tactical things. We're sort of wrapping this up here. These are the last few slides because I want plenty of time for you guys to ask questions. So really tactical advice. You always have to have a definition of ready and a definition of done in place. This has to be something that the product team and the dev team agree on what does ready look like. It's small, it's clear, it's independent. Once you agree on that, that conversation about, you know what, this isn't ready becomes much easier. The PO will go, yeah, you know what, you're right. We spent too much time talking about this. Clearly, I'm not straight on what I intend, and so I'll take it back and I'll go work on it. If you don't have a clear definition of ready in place, that conversation gets really hard. You have to come to refinement with that list of clear prioritized story, because then you can just go through and just keep yourself a couple sprints ahead. Time box it, 5 minutes a story. If you need to catch up, so say you're in a position where you're constantly playing catch up, and you're currently grooming stories for the sprint that you're currently in, which is bad, don't do that. If you need to spend time catching up, take a breath and build time into your next sprint. Make it a task, put some story points on it. Allow yourselves the opportunity to get caught up, and that will open up so much time for you to be able to actually do the work. A lot of times when we get really far behind, we try to catch up. And so then we have to put more meetings on the calendar, which takes away meeting time, which makes us further and further behind. And so then we put more meetings on the calendar to deal with the fact that we're further behind. This is a death spiral. So you need to stop it, and you need to get caught up, because going forward, if you do vanilla Scrum and you're doing 3 amigos and you're having these kinds of grooming sessions and planning sessions, it will give everybody space to breathe. And the maintenance of this backlog is so much easier than the constant struggle of trying to catch up. So what does this look like in practice? You come in, I love it when a PO owns this invite because the PO is the one that's up to their eyeballs in the backlog and kind of know, are we about 2 sprints ahead or not? So, hey, if I'm feeling good about what we've got estimated, then I can cancel the meeting and give the team some time back. So I like it when a PO owns the meeting. That's not written in stone. The Scrum Master could own it. Anybody could own it really, but just make sure it happens. The PO will start off with a brief overview of which stories we're intending to groom. Like, hey, remember that feature? These are the kinds of stories that we're going into it. We're going to try to finish up this screen. Be very clear about what you intend to accomplish in this meeting. Have a timekeeper. Could be the Scrum Master, could be anybody, but somebody's got to have the timer on their phone with that loud, obnoxious ring at the end so the whole team knows that time's up. We're going to move on. If you have your backlog in priority order, then the order in which you groom things is starting at the top and just working your way down. That's all you have to do. That's why it's so important to keep things in priority order. What that does is ensure that you as a team are not spending your time grooming something that's not going to happen for 6 months. You are grooming the next immediate thing on your list. That is why having a backlog in priority order is so important, because you want to be sure that you are grooming things on the right time horizon. I want to groom the next immediate things and not stuff that may not even ever happen because it's so far down the road. And so you just keep going until your session ends. If you're not anywhere near this state, which is entirely possible, we've got about 70 people on the phone, so odds are at least one of you is not anywhere near this state. You can get there in a couple of different ways. One of them is just to start by creating this definition of ready. It's what does a good story look like for our Scrum team? Let us help you write some stories. Let's understand what good gherkins look like. Let's understand what small looks like and independent looks like and clear looks like for our Scrum team. So start there if you don't have one already. Start practicing writing gherkins. I strongly recommend, and this is something that I implement with my teams, and I actually help doing this too. If you're having some trouble getting caught up, as a Scrum team, come together and help your PO out with writing gherkins. This is great for lots of reasons. One of them, you get good at writing gherkins and you recognize good ones when you see them. Excuse me, I'm gonna grab a quick drink of water. So you know what a good gherkin looks like. Oddly, that didn't help at all. Sorry.
Well, let's pause for a second because we do want to collect some questions. We have a few, but feel free to take this moment to stick in your burning questions so we can get to them all.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't think I've ever had this many interruptions in a webinar. So
makes it exciting.
Keeps it fresh. Okay, so start with your definition of ready. Get really good at writing gherkins. As a Scrum team, help your PO catch up, because guess what? If your PO is caught up, that means you will know exactly what you need to be doing, which means less swirl about having to go track down your PO and ask a question and get clarity on a thing. All of that goes away. So that will actually make your lives a lot better. Just buckle down, write a few gherkins with your PO. It helps you recognize what a good one is. It will help them get caught up, and that will make your life a lot better. It's not going to become your day job, but it is. It's great when a team can come together and get their backlog in order. Finally, you want to get in a 2 sprints at some point. This is your end game. You want to get to about 2 sprints ahead. You want to make sure that if you use 3 Amigos or some other version of this, make sure that your architects or lead devs and your lead QA and your UI UX folks and your POs are talking about features a couple of months ahead of when you anticipate the Scrum team to be working on them, so that these major architectural and design and flow questions don't come up in grooming because they've already been answered. And then finally, your stories, your things in Jira or TFS or whatever tool you're using should not be conversation starters. They should be the outcomes of your conversations. I can't tell you how many times I've seen Jira tickets that have like copy pasted email threads where people are just swirling back and forth trying to answer questions, or, that is just noise. So eliminate that stuff. When you have an idea of what these stories need to look like and what the requirements are, you've had all the conversations about architecture and design, then start getting these nice, crisp, clean stories into Jira and leave all that mess somewhere else. Finally, in grooming, here's some what we call anti-patterns in Agile. Never really like that word, but it seems to fit. So one of the things that you want to look out for is over-solutioning. That is something that devs tend to do a lot because we're all problem solvers, and we want to figure it out now. Remember that you just need to know enough to give a good enough estimate, something that you're comfortable with. You don't have to solution the whole entire thing. Sometimes you run into, well, we could implement it this way or we could implement it that way. It's okay to say, well, if we implement it this way, it's 3 story points. If we implement it that way, it's 8 story points, but we're going to spend some time figuring out which one it is, and then we can come back and revisit this, right? So that's a totally fine approach. If you're not quite sure exactly how you're going to implement it, especially if that depends on something maybe you're currently working on, feel free to just kind of give a shot, you know, at estimating in the 2 possible scenarios. It's totally fine. Do not accept stories that are not ready. We all are people pleasers. We want to make sure if somebody asks us to do something that we do it. Don't do that. It's okay. It's okay to send it back. As long as it doesn't conform to your definition of ready, it's all right to say, hey, we need more information. We don't want to swirl for 2 hours on just, you know, trying to get a clear idea of what you want. The other thing really to look out for in grooming, now remember, I haven't talked at all about relative estimation or team dynamics while this is going on, but remember, this is the ceremony where that stuff is happening. You might be using planning poker, you might be just doing whatever, you know, using some other app, you might just be putting your fingers up in the air, however it is that you're doing relative estimation. You, need to be sure that your devs and QA are putting out their estimates as a team at the same time. Do not split this up between the dev estimate and the QA estimate. Everybody is putting their estimate together for what this piece of work might entail. And be sure that everybody in that room is heard with, you know, any questions they might have. This means if you're like me and you're a loudmouth and you like to talk and jump in when somebody asks a question, you need to learn to shut up, just like I did. So count in your head to 8. Let the quiet people on the team ask their questions. Let them voice their concerns before you jump in there. So it's a really hard thing to do. I've been working on it for 20 years. I still can't get it quite right. So I have lots of sympathy for you, but you've got to start working on that. Let the quiet people be heard, because guess what? Usually the quiet people, they're the ones that are right. They're usually the ones with the good questions and the good answers. And the other thing, as a PO, be sure that you have a clear goal for the session. If you get in there and you kind of swirl and people are scrolling up and down in the backlog, like, well, maybe we could estimate this story. Don't do that. If you're at that state, cancel the session, get out of that state, and then put a session on the calendar, okay? So what does a successful grooming or refinement session look like? You come out of there understanding all of the requirements and how you're going to implement it just well enough. Again, don't over solution it to provide a reasonable story point estimate for it and get your backlog into being about 2 sprints ahead. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Audrey, who's been diligently monitoring the chat channel for questions.